Welcome to the Macdownunder Podcast for all Australian Apple computer enthusiasts and collectors.
Welcome to episode 39 of the Macdownunder Podcast. I'm Justin, and thanks for joining me today for this episode. I know that the networking episodes don't seem to have done quite as well as the earlier ones, particularly the 50th anniversary. I think we've got a bit of a boost there from the algorithm. However, for those of you who have stayed with me, thanks so much, and really appreciate the comments and so forth coming through. Now, I've had a ball doing the research for this series of episodes. In fact, all of the episodes we've done, but in particular these networking episodes, because I'm finding out so much that I didn't know about Apple's networking products. Even though, according to the Steve Jobs, Apple's not a networking company. I've discovered a whole heap that I missed out on discussing in previous episodes. So I'm going to dedicate an entire episode to catching up all of the missed pieces, new finds, and anyone that's commented, please feel free to comment even on this video. If I've missed anything important or something that you think I need to mention, I'll do that in the catch-up episode, quite possibly in the next episode. So things like Apple's school bus. Who knew Apple made a school bus? Not one with wheels, a networking one, but we'll talk about that. There's an example that I just missed completely. Plain Insight, where Apple used the Apple bus for daisy chain serial connections. I even showed it to you, but forgot to mention it, so we'll catch up with that. Apple Bus for Lisa, the Apple II Apple Talk cards. So we mentioned the workstation card. There was an earlier one. Token Talk we'll catch up with. TwinX, didn't even know existed, and a whole lot more. So that'll be a catch-up episode. So I haven't forgotten about it. We will get there. But for today, I'm going to continue where we left off last episode, where we talked about Apple Talk, and today focus on Ethernet devices. Now, I've got to say, there's not a lot of documentation around all of Apple's Ethernet devices. So I've pulled together as much as I can. I'm sure I'm missing some information. I'm sure I'm missing parts of my collection because I've discovered that as I've gone along. So here we go, on to today's episode and Ethernet. So according to various sources, Ethernet can trace its origins back to the 1960s and Aloha Net, which was actually designed for radio. But the team at Xerox PARC, we talked about them before, so that's where Apple got introduced to the GUI, which led to the Lisa and ultimately the Macintosh, laser printers, which ultimately led to the laser writer, and networking. And what they actually saw at Xerox PARC was a very early form of Ethernet, because Xerox PARC approached the Aloha Net team and adapted it in the 1970s to become a networking protocol. And the real difference here between Token Talk and Ethernet is that Ethernet will continue repeating the packets being sent until there is a receive signal, so that it guarantees that the information is sent if there's someone to receive it, a bit like on a radio, which is where Aloha Net came from. So eventually, to keep this as a bit more of an open standard, the Xerox team signed on Digital Equipment and Intel, plus themselves at Xerox, to form the DIX partnership, which I've only just learned about recently. And eventually, in 1983, they published the Ethernet Blue Book, which really established the first quasi-standard for Ethernet. It became a formal standard later on. So it started off as 10 base 5. So 10 talked about the 10 megabits per second speed. The base was baseband as compared to broadband, and 5 meant that it could be used over a length of 500 meters. Now, the original 10 base 5 was a rigid coax cable. So not particularly flexible, not particularly useful in a large working area, but certainly proved the point. And it used a 15-pin interface for the attachment unit interface, the AUI transceivers that it used. And of course, another name for this that I've not heard much is ThickNet. So because of the rigid coax and the large interface, ThickNet was the name that was adopted by that particular standard. It was effectively a daisy chain, but the connections needed to be made physically through the wire. So you screwed and pinned through the wire rather than daisy chaining with connectors as we saw with Apple Talk last week. But in 1984, the standard for 10 base 2, which we're probably a bit more familiar with, again 10 megabits per second, still baseband, but this time over a 200 metre coaxial cable. But this was a flexible coaxial cable. Again, transceivers were generally built into the interface cards. They were daisy chained, as I mentioned, and they used T-pieces for each of the connections. So you had your interface in the computer, you put in your T-piece, and then the coaxial cable connected to both sides of the T-piece. Now, like Apple Talk, it needed termination, and so were there caps you had to screw in to the end of each of the daisy chain, a bit like Apple Talk. In particular, PhoneNet, where you needed the resistors in each end. So in 1987, Apple introduced EtherTalk. So this was the Apple Talk protocol over Ethernet. They also introduced a NUBUS card that was capable of both 10 base 5 ThickNet and 10 base 2 the ThinNet. So this was a NUBUS card for the Macintosh 2 series. Now in 1990, 10 base T became a standard. So this one was 10 megabits per second, again on baseband, but the T was for twisted pair, which meant that you could use essentially a high quality phone cable to connect to the Ethernet. But you now needed a hub or a router to connect this one-on-one twisted pair into. So in 1991, Apple introduced the new Quadra line. They still used NUBUS, but Apple decided to build Ethernet into the motherboards, into the computer itself. Now, they used a new standard that they developed themselves. So it was the Apple Attachment Unit Interface, AAUI, which they called FriendlyNet, because what you could do was plug either a ThickNet, a ThinNet, or a 10 base T transceiver into it. So it used a 15-pin mini connector, which I'll show you in a moment, on the computer motherboard, the same as the AUI standard. Some say Apple did this, the micro connector with the auto release, instead of the standard DB15, because Apple was already using DB15 for their video cards. So having two outputs on the back of your Quadra that looked the same, despite probably having different icons, apparently was considered too dangerous and not user-friendly. So they introduced this new AAUI standard. But it also meant that Apple only needed to put one connector on the back of their computer, and then you'd buy the appropriate transceiver. So there was the 10 base T transceiver, which there are many of these around. In fact, I've got some in the for sale section I was pleased to find. So you plug your AAUI interface into the computer, and then you connect your twisted pair large high quality telephone cable into the transceiver and then off into your network hub. But they also made transceivers for ThinNet, which are much longer cable, because ThinNet generally ran along the ground or in the wall of the computer facility. But again, you plug your AAUI interface into the computer, but then at the other end, you had your ThinNet BNC connections. In fact, Apple even made their own very overstandard cable to connect into the BNC connections and then daisy chain off to the next computer. Now, what Apple did with their transceiver, however, very much like Apple Talk, they made it user-friendly, and so you don't need termination. These are self-terminating transceivers, which I didn't know and must have been a great selling feature at the time, but probably lost to history and people's understanding if you weren't involved in building networks. Apple also eventually put out this huge beastie. So as you can see, this plugs into standard power. This is an Australian version, so 240 volt power. And so at the other end, again, we've got our AAUI connector to connect into your Apple computer. But this has got an AUI as well, the DB15 connection. So this would connect into your ThickNet and would work in either direction. So if you had a router that used ThickNet, you could use this. If you had a printer or some other device, this was your ThickNet interface. But it's enormous. And my understanding is that ThickNet actually has a 12 volt circuit in it, and that's why it's got the extra transformer built into the transceiver. Now, Apple also then updated their NUBUS Ethernet adapter to use the AAUI standard. And here's an example of the newer AAUI-based NUBUS Ethernet card. Now, all of mine are in box and sealed, so I figured, why not do an unboxing as part of this episode? So here goes. So this is an Apple Ethernet NUBUS card. It's not got a lot of labeling on it, but on the back it does talk about the various transceivers you can use, and also suggests that there's an LC card available as well, which I'll show you later. All right, so let's crack into the plastic. And now let's get the card out of its box. So what have we got? We've got the sealed Apple Ethernet NUBUS card user guide, still in its shrink wrap. We have the Apple 1-year limited warranty. Great to see. I wonder if I can submit that, and how to use on the back. Then we have the packing list for the Apple Ethernet NUBUS card. And so we should have a NUBUS card, a floppy disk with the EtherTalk installer disk, the manual we've seen, the warranty registration card, and the license agreement booklet, which we have seen. So let's take a look underneath the foam, and there it is. Upside down, as it turns out, the Ethernet card in the shrink wrap. So let's just get it out carefully and put it on the shrink wrap. The smell of new electronics. Yes, it's got that new electronics smell. So there we can see it's a NUBUS card. It has the AAUI adapter. It has the transmit receive LEDs. And this one is based on a Motorola and Texas Instrument chipset. So there you go. I'll put a close-up photo in a moment. But that was the upgraded NUBUS card, but still extremely over-engineered for what it needed to be in the day. However, it worked. So in 1990 to 1991, Apple also worked on an Ethernet card for the Apple II series of computers. They had 2 attempts at making one. The first one was based on the Apple II workstation card that I showed last week, which was designed for Apple Talk. It used a 6502 processor, 32K of RAM, and made use of a AAUI connector. Now, I can't find a photo of this version online at all. There's documentation and schematics, but I can't find a photo of this card anywhere. In 1992 to 1993, Apple had a second attempt at making the Ethernet card. Now, this was a complete redesign, so it wasn't based on the Apple II workstation card. It used off-the-shelf parts, which apparently was unusual for Apple at the time. And this one was based on the 65C816, so the same processor as used in the Apple II GS, a 16-bit processor compared to the earlier 8-bit processor. It also has 64K of RAM. There was a new version of ProDOS 8-bit made for the Apple IIe, and a new version of the GS OS, the operating system for the Apple II GS. However, the Ethernet card and the GS OS were pulled immediately prior to launch in 1993, which caused delay in the launch of GS OS because Apple had cancelled the Ethernet card. The rumours persist that it was really, they were worried about the Apple II taking away from some of the Macintosh sales if it was capable of Ethernet. Now, if you can get your hands on one of these cards, I don't have one, so thanks to those that have posted photos. But if you can find one of these, whilst the support for it was removed from GSOS, the newer Marinetti TCP/IP stack that's been made by third-party developers, been around for a little while now, has the software to enable this card to work on your Apple IIgs. So back to the Macintosh, and in 1991, alongside all these other developments, Apple released the LC processor direct card for Ethernet. And here's an example that I've pulled for one of my machines. So this has got the LC processor direct connector. Looks a bit like NUBUS, but it's not. This is the PDS adapter with a AAUI input-output for the back panel of the computer, and again copyrighted from 1991. So this is the AAUI version. They also made a 10-base-2 version, ThinNet, and they also later had a twisted pair version with a 10-base-T output, but this was the universal version. In 1995, Apple released the communications slot in their lower cost machines, and so they introduced COM slot Ethernet adapters as well. This is a COM slot 2 Ethernet adapter. Now these came out in a AAUI configuration, which I don't have. They came out in a ThinNet version, the 10-base-2, and they also came out in the twisted pair 10-base-T, which this one happens to be. Now, Apple also made accessories for the various Ethernet adapters that they sold. So they had coax cables, I've already shown you. They also had twisted pair cables, pretty expensive for what they were, but if you wanted an Apple branded one, you could get those. And of course, they had their AAUI transceivers. But they also made this hub. So this is the Apple Ethernet 10-base-5 workgroup hub. The 10-base-5, well, the 5-bit really refers to the fact that it's got the AAUI connector, the 15-pin connector at one end that you could plug into your printer or plug into your computer. But it then provided 4 10-base-T twisted pair outputs and could be powered by an external power supply. So there you go, there's a pretty unusual Apple accessory for Apple networking, given Apple, according to Steve Jobs, isn't a networking company. So let's look at some of the Apple products that could use the AAUI Ethernet adapters. So in terms of the computers, the Centrus lines of computers, which were the budget version of the Quadra, had AAUI connectors, except for the very base models. All of the Quadra models, from the Quadra 700 right up to the Quadra 840 AV, the fastest Quadra that they made, all had AAUI connectors. In fact, most of the Power Macs did, from the Power Mac 6100 that was launched early on, right through to the last non-G3 version, the 9600 Tower. Interestingly, the DuoDock 2 has a AAUI connector. I had a look, the original DuoDock didn't, but you could actually add in an adapter board if you wished. The PowerBook 500 series came with AAUI adapters, and of course all of the workgroup servers did, right through from the workgroup server 60 right through to the workgroup server 9650. And the Apple Network server, I happen to have a couple of those, they've got AAUI as well. In terms of printers, there's a whole range of laser printers there that I'm not going to mention, but you can see them there, and all the accessories that I've spoken about so far. So they're all AAUI devices using Apple's proprietary connector. But by the mid-90s, it was pretty clear that 10-base-T, the twisted pair version, was the version of Ethernet that was gaining global acceptance. And so in 1996, Apple started producing products that used 10-base-T instead of their original AAUI. So that meant that their NUBUS card, their LC card, and their COM slot cards all got remanufactured with 10-base-T outputs. So some other interesting things as well. In 1996, Apple released the Style Writer EtherTalk adapter. Now this was actually a Farallon device that Farallon was already selling, but Apple had them put it in the Apple beige, platinum in fact, and rebadge it as an Apple product. And it was available for the Style Rider 1200 and the Color Style Riders 1500, 2200, 2400 and 2500. A year later, they updated this to the Style Rider EtherTalk Adapter 2. Now I can't find a photo of this one, so if you've got one, let me know. And this one worked for the Color Style Riders 4100, 4500 and 6500. And in addition to this, Apple also updated their laser printers. So the Color Laser Riders and the Laser Rider 16600 and 12640 and the Laser Rider 8500 were all 10 base T capable. So in 1997, Apple released the beige Power Mac G3, and this was the first computer, well, the first desktop computer that switched from AAUI and included 10 base T directly on the motherboard. Now, it is listed as the first Apple computer, but in fact, the PowerBook 3400C came out in February earlier that year and also included 10 base T as an option in most of their configurations. So here's the list of all the 10 base T capable computers of the day. So the PowerBook 3400, the Power Mac G3 and all the Power Macs beyond that, and the PowerBook G3 and all the PowerBooks beyond that as well. Now what we find is that the LC and Performer models didn't come with 10 base T, but certainly had the option of the expansion card relevant to that particular computer. Now in 1993, the Ethernet standard got adjusted to allow for 100 base TX. This was 100 megabits per second. And Apple responded by releasing cards like this one, which is the Apple Fast Ethernet card, 100 base TX. I pulled this one from a Power Mac 9600. Now Fast Ethernet became standard with the iMac G3 in 1998. It also got introduced into the Power Macs with the blue and white G3 in 1999 and in the PowerBooks from the Lombard series onwards, also from 1999. Now fast forward to 2008, with the release of the MacBook Air, we no longer had an Ethernet port on the computer to keep its size down. Instead, Apple released this USB 2 to Ethernet adapter. It was still fast Ethernet at 100 base TX, but could be used with any modern Macintosh from 2008 onwards with USB 2 to provide Ethernet access. So let's rewind back now to 1999. So whilst Apple was releasing all of their FastNet products, in the meantime, the Ethernet standard had now approved 1000 base TX, or what we've come to know as Gigabit Ethernet. So in July 2000, the Power Mac G4 Gigabit Ethernet was released. In 2001, the PowerBook Titanium Gigabit Ethernet version was released. And in 2003, there was cards like this, Gigabit Ethernet card released for PCI X, in this case for my Xserve G4. In 2009, there was a PCIe card for the Xserve 2005. And in 2012, Apple released this, the Thunderbolt to Gigabit Ethernet adapter, which apparently at the time was loved because of the high-speed Ethernet that it could provide your Thunderbolt-capable computer. There were a huge number of devices made by third parties that supported Apple's implementation of AppleTalk and Ethernet. So for example, this Sonic Local Talk to Ethernet adapter. So you plugged in your AppleTalk computer, device or network at one end and connected it to your Ethernet network on the other, either ThinNet coax or 10 base T twisted pair. The other port there is for power. So using this device, you could connect your AppleTalk printer to your Ether network or your Apple II workstation card to the Ethernet network, or even your Lisa on the Local Talk network to Ethernet. So that's one way to get your legacy products onto Ethernet using a local talk to Ethernet adapter. Another way of connecting your devices to Ethernet was a product like this. Now this is another Sonic device, but this one is SCSI to Ethernet. So at one end we have our SCSI connector to connect to your SCSI device, usually your computer, with the SCSI ID able to be set. And at the other end, again, we have ThinNet or 10 base T. Now, the interesting thing with this one is it comes with a power cable that actually plugs into your ADB mouse or keyboard port to provide power. So this one was easy to set up and didn't need an external power supply. Very useful for on the go for your PowerBooks, for example, because you didn't need a power brick. However, you could use this device again to connect to your Apple II. Not particularly efficient. There are better ways of doing that, like the Lance GS and Ethernet. But you could also use it to connect to your Lisa, for example, running MacWorks. But you'd also need the Sun Remarketing SCSI card on your Lisa as well. So not super easy, but you could still do it. So you could use it for your Macs that had SCSI, but didn't have any other internal expansion available for an Ethernet card. For example, your Mac Plus, your Mac Classic, or the Mac Classic 2, and some of the laptops could use this to access Ethernet. Now, there are other third-party options as well. So NUBUS cards, PCI cards, LC Ethernet cards, ComSlot Ethernet cards, and an interesting case with the Mac SE and the SE30. So despite that both of those computers have internal expansion available, as far as I'm aware, Apple never made an official Ethernet expansion card, but there are heaps of third-party options out there to make those computers Ethernet capable internally. And for laptops, there's PCM-CIA cards available as well. Again, as far as I'm aware, Apple never made one. I've only seen one reference with no photos and no source material. Otherwise, I can't find any evidence of an Apple-provided PCM-CIA Ethernet card. However, there are plenty around that work with your PowerBooks and also with your Apple Newton. So, have you got any of these older Apple Ethernet devices in your collection, particularly the really early NUBUS cards? If you've got an Apple II Ethernet card that was made by Apple, I would love to see it. Anyway, which ones have you got? Are you still using them? Which one is your favourite? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. So recent news, well, the huge news is that Apple is getting a new CEO. So as I'm sure you've heard by now, Tim Cook is going to become the executive chairman of Apple Computer, and John Ternus, who was previously the senior vice president of hardware engineering, is going to become the new CEO. He has a bachelor degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania and joined Apple in 2001, focusing pretty heavily on hardware design and production. So I look forward to seeing what devices come out under John's term as CEO. On to coming events. And Technology Markets held their most recent vintage computer display last Sunday, and they haven't had a chance to update their website. Link down in the description, check in to see when the next one's on. WasFest coming up in New South Wales on the 23rd of May. Again, this is held in a private home, so check with the organisers for details, links down in the description. The Mac Museum held their last open day last Saturday. It was great to get down there and see some new faces and old favourites. Their next open day is Saturday the 9th of May from 10 until 2 in Somerville, Victoria. Links down in the description. The Adelaide Retro Computing Group have their next meeting on Friday the 8th of May from 5:30 until 10:30 in the Unley Community Centre in South Australia. Links down in the description. Retro Gaming Bendigo have their next meeting this Sunday, the 26th of April from 12:30 for a 1 o'clock start, again in their new venue at the Huntley Memorial Hall just near Bendigo, Victoria. Links down in the description. Now, if you have a retro computing event or gathering coming up, particularly if it involves Apple computers, please let me know. I'm more than happy to promote it for you. On to this week's for sale section, and I'm pleased to say there are plenty of Apple branded Ethernet products available in Australia for not too much. First up, we have an Apple Mac Ethernet to USB 2 adapter, just like the one that I showed you in the show today. Now, it's available in Melbourne for $5. That's less than I paid for the one I got in for the show. And I've seen similar prices in New South Wales as well. Next, Apple's Thunderbolt to Ethernet adapter. Again, I showed you one of these in the show too. This one's new in box and only $5. Again, from Melbourne, Victoria. Again, that's less than I paid for the one I got in to show you. Next up, we have the Xserve G5 Gigabit PCIe Ethernet network adapter. Now, I don't have one of these, so look out, I might be bidding myself. This one's in New South Wales for $79.95. I was really pleased to find these two Apple Ethernet twisted pair transceivers. These are the AAUI transceivers. They're not around often anymore, but there's two of them available in Perth for $100. And last up, we've got an Apple Ethernet ComSlot 2 twisted pair Ethernet network card. That's exactly the one that I showed you. Now it says it's here for the Power Mac 4400. In fact, it'll work on any ComSlot 2 machine. This one's available in New South Wales for $149.95. It is a little pricey, but there's not many around. Well, that brings us to the end of episode 39 of the Macdownunder Podcast and our discussion on Apple's integration of Ethernet into their early computers. Please let me know what you thought down in the comments. Now, next week again, probably a catch-up episode with all the other wired networks that Apple had some form of touch point with. There's plenty to talk about, so I hope you come back next week. So don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks again for joining me today, and until next time, take care. Thank you for joining the Macdownunder Podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.